As we're thinking about it a little bit more, you're quite right. If God was omniscient, then God would know what Eve was going to do before Eve did it. This is another perfect example of an instance in which a biblical author has a very different conception of God's attributes than we might today as a result of centuries of systematic theology. God is not presented as being omniscient in any of the stories composed by J, one of our 4 Pentateuchal authors, especially in these mythic primeval sections in Genesis chapters 1 through 11. God isn't even presented as being particularly bright or perceptive about the world around God. For example, God does not know that Adam is going to be lonely, God does not know that the animals aren't going to satisfy that loneliness, and God does not know that the creation of Eve is going to lead to the first instance of disobedience. Even after that, God does not appear to know that Adam and Eve have eaten from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and after that, God has to take remedial steps to force Adam and Eve out of the garden lest they eat from the fruit of the tree of life. This is a series of actions that would only be undertaken by somebody without much in the way of foresight, and somebody who is just making things up as they go. God apparently does not see Cain murdering Abel and seems quite surprised afterwards that it happened at all. God apparently neither foresees nor notices these legions of minor divinities sleeping with human women at the beginning of Genesis chapter 6 that leads to the corruption of the human race. And since this process unfolds over the course of at least a generation, that's a long time for God to be an absentee landlord. And again, afterwards, God has to take remedial action in the form of the flood. God does not foresee or even notice the construction of the Tower of Babel in its early stages, and again has to step in belatedly with a remedial solution to the problem, when it seems like this could have been solved from the beginning with a simple conversation or something like that. God is not omniscient in any way that we would recognize in any of these stories. And frankly, that's not too surprising. The Bible is developing the idea of God's nature and God's attributes over time, just as we continue to develop the idea of God's nature and God's attributes over time. Philosophers of religion today continue to discuss what it would mean for a being to be omniscient. A basic definition of omniscience today might look something like this. A being is omniscient if they immediately and intuitively know all true propositions. But this definition still leaves a lot to be desired. One problem with this definition is that it seems like the set of all true propositions is something that is in a constant state of flux. For example, how many helium atoms are there in the universe? Well, presumably God would know this number, but the number would be constantly changing. Or what day is today relative to our calendar here on Earth? Presumably God would know this as well, but also it would be in a constant state of flux. And if God's knowledge of the universe is perfect and God has eternally known all these things, then it seems difficult to square that with a set of true propositions that's constantly fluctuating from day to day. There are also sincere questions about whether or not God's knowledge contains counterfactual statements, that is, hypothetical statements that aren't true now but could be true given certain conditions. There are also questions about whether or not there are any true propositions about the future, and if there aren't, then God's omniscience wouldn't cover that. If we're still working on this idea today, then it's not really a surprise that the Bible doesn't have it down yet.